Hey guys, Buildzoid here, and today we're going to be taking a look at the 1080 Ti Gaming X from MSI. So, just at the PCB and the makeup of the different the really important VRMs for overclocking, so the ones that will actually be put under more load if you increase core frequency and core voltage, as well as the ones that are the ones that actually you would want to actually increase the voltages on.
Before that, this coverage is brought to you by the Computex Conference, which runs from May 30th to June 3rd in Taipei, Taiwan this year. Computex is the biggest event of the year for PC hardware and technology, where we preview the newest prototypes before they come to market. We highly recommend attending or following this event online. For industry professionals and enthusiasts, learn more at the link in the description below.
Before we get to the details of those VRMs, we'll go over all the different VRMs that power the card that I can identify. Please understand, I'm only ever given pictures, so the card is on the other side of the Atlantic, and a lot of the time I just have to rely on my ability to read component numbers, and sometimes that's just not enough to tell what a certain set of components actually does on the card. So, with that out of the way, let's get started with the identification of the different componentry. First of all, up here we have this, which is a Ldo Low Dropout Regulator. This thing outputs 1.8 volts. This is a voltage that the NVIDIA EEPROM and some internal PLLs of the GPU require. So, this right here under it is actually the BIOS chip, so that explains the proximity there. Under that, we find this VRM right here, and this is the pump voltage for the GDDR5X chips. This is also 1.8 volts. However, you just don't want to be powering two completely separate systems with the same VRM for basically safety reasons. So this is a necessary voltage for the GDDR5X chips to function. However, this voltage will not, there is no reason to tweak this voltage. First of all, you don't have access to controlling this voltage through software, and secondly, even if you did a hardware mod on this voltage, it really doesn't do very much for if you raise it or lower it for your ability to overclock the GDDR5X any further. Now then, moving down here, we find the 1 volt PEX or PLL voltage, whichever you prefer to call it. This powers some of the GPU's internal PLLs and is necessary for the GPU to function. On air cooling and water cooling, messing with this voltage does nothing. Again, you can't access it through software. You would have to do a physical mod on the card to get control over this voltage. And that's only really worth it if you want to take the card on LN2, as this voltage can help with the behavior of the card at very low temperatures. However, again, it's not super important. Now then, moving on further, behind that we find the Vcore Vrm, so the one that takes up the most PCB space and is generally the one that you'll see spec'd in most marketing materials. This supplies the bulk of the power for the GPU core. This one you do have some very limited software voltage control over, as 1080 Ti's ship with a stock voltage of around 1.06 volts, and NVIDIA does allow you to tweak the voltage up to 1.093 volts. So you can actually increase this one a little bit, and that does help you with overclocking. Now then, sort of to the left of that VRM, we find the memory VRM. So this powers the GDDR5X memory chips. It outputs 1.35 volts, and this one, you don't have software access. You can't control this voltage through the software. However, if you were to actually do a physical mod to the card, tweaking this voltage should increase GDDR5X overclocking range. Not a whole lot, mind you, but it will give you a few extra megahertz while massively increasing power draw, so, not really worth doing. And finally, on the very end of the card, we find this looks to be a buck converter, and I'm going to assume that this is the phase drive VRM, because I really, like, every other voltage that is necessary for the GPU core and the VRAM to function is already here. However, VRMs actually need separate voltages other than what the PCIe slot and the 8-pin supply. So these are 12 volts power supply, and this down here is plus 12 volts and plus 3.3 volts. MOSFETs do not run on either of them. So this right here should be a 5 volt or maybe 5 to 10 volt VRM that then powers all the actual switching capabilities of the MOSFETs. So that's what that there is. This has no impact on overclocking in the slightest, as it literally, this goes straight to the VRMs and doesn't affect the GPU directly in any way, shape, or form. So, with all of the little VRMs on the card out of the way, let's start taking a closer look at the actual VRMs than at the two big ones, which would be the Vcore and the memory VRM. So, starting with the Vcore VRM, we can clearly see we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 inductors, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16 dual FET packages. So one of these is actually so we'll actually go over what these are. So these right here are FDPC 5018 SGs from Fairchild Semiconductor, who are now part of ON Semiconductor. So they've been bought by ON Semiconductor. Now, this is two MOSFETs in a single chip. So this one chip right here has both a high side MOSFET and a low side MOSFET. The high side MOSFET is 6.5 milliohms of resistance. And I'm going to try get that symbol. There, 6.5 milliohms at 4.5 volts. And the high side and the low side MOSFET is 2.2 milliohms at the same 4.5 volts drive voltage. So this is actually a slightly higher resistance than what the card will be running, because VRM that powers the actual... Yeah, the VRM that powers the main VRM will actually be outputting something between 5 and 10 volts, which is higher than the 4.5 volts that this is spec'd at. So the resistance of these MOSFETs will be slightly lower and they'll be a little bit more efficient. However, for the purpose of making sure that my calculations don't overestimate the capabilities of the VRM, I always use the lowest voltage rating available for the RDS on, so the drain to source on resistance. Yeah. So we have 16 of these, and then for actual control of the VRM, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 driver ICs. So what this tells us is this is a 8-phase VRM, and it is a true 8-phase just based off the fact that we have 8 driver ICs. There's no doublers or quadruplers on the back of the PCB. And also this chip right here is an NCP 81274. So that's an ON Semiconductor 8-phase voltage controller. This does 8 phases up to 1.2 megahertz switching frequency, which is twice the switching frequency that you will find on any of the cards using the UP9511 voltage controller, which is standard for most 1080 Ti's, as that is the voltage controller that NVIDIA uses on their Founders Edition, Asus uses it, Gigabyte uses it as well. So this card actually has the most complex voltage controller out of all the 1080 Ti's available, while not necessarily having the largest VRM. So in terms of regulation capabilities, this VRM should be one of the cleanest running for voltage regulation. Not that that will make a huge difference in terms of actual overclocking, as you've probably already seen from all the reviews of the card. Speaking of reviews, the full review for this card will actually be coming out in a few days, so, stay tuned for that later. Now then, with the voltage controller out of the way, let's talk about actual current capability for this VRM. Now, the FDPC 5018 SGs are slightly worse in terms of efficiency compared to the FDPC 8016 SG. 8016 SGs used on the Founders Edition 1080 Ti. However, 4 MOSFETs per phase, because there's There, you know, you have one high side MOSFET and one low side MOSFET in each of these chips, and there's 2 of those chips for each phase, so in total you have 4 MOSFETs. Hard to keep track of sometimes. So this does actually have more MOSFETs, and if you have more MOSFETs, then it spreads the load across them evenly, which means overall this VRM, even using slightly worse in terms of spec MOSFETs, matches the Founders Edition card in terms of efficiency and power throughput capabilities. So at 250 amps, you can expect this VRM. So 125 degrees operating temperature. That's because you don't really want to push a VRM past that. 125 degrees, and assuming 300 kilohertz switching frequency and 1 volt operating voltage. So core getting 1.1 volts. This VRM at 250 amps load would output 15 watts of heat. So that's pretty much the same as the Founders Edition. At 400 amps load, it would put out 40 watts of heat. And if you had some ridiculous amount of cooling, the VRM would fail at 700 amps, assuming you could dissipate the 120 watts of heat that it outputs. And when it fails, the low side MOSFETs would be actually what goes, not the high side. Though considering that they're both in the same package, if the low side MOSFET goes, it's going to destroy the high side MOSFET along with it, since they are sharing silicon. So, well, sharing space. I'm not entirely sure how the internals are arranged, but generally dual NFETs will be one piece of silicon inside the packaging. So if the low side MOSFET blows, you have to replace the whole thing, which, you know, that's sort of predictable. So in terms of power capability, this VRM has the same kind of capabilities as the Founders Edition. It is not more efficient or less efficient. However, this VRM, due to its layout, will be easier to cool, as it's much more spread out than what you find in the Founders Edition. And also, unlike the Founders Edition, the Gaming X's stock heatsink is a lot better. So yeah, if you want actual detailed thermals for the VRM, you will find that in the review coming out very soon. Now then, moving on to the memory VRM. The memory VRM using the exact same dual NFETs. So again, the FDPC 5018s. From Fairchild, this is a 2-phase VRM controlled by a UP1658. This goes up to 300 kilohertz on its 2-phase output. So this is actually one of the slower VRM controllers on a memory VRM amongst the 1080 Ti's. However, it really doesn't matter, as nobody actually runs their voltage controllers at maximum frequency output because it ruins VRM efficiency. Generally, you will find all VRMs running around 300 to 500 kilohertz on GPUs. So this is not really a disadvantage, even though it does mean that you can't actually exceed that switching frequency if you, for whatever reason, wanted to do that, because as I said, it won't really do, it shouldn't really do anything for overclocking on the memory, as that doesn't seem to scale from extra voltage. Now then, the actual current capability of the memory VRM is it maxes out at 88 amps, and I'll need to figure out where to put this. So it maxes out at 88 amps, assuming that you can dissipate 15 watts of heat. However, under normal operating conditions, this VRM should only ever be handling about maximum of 30 amps to the memory chips, which leads to about 2 watts of heat output. So this VRM right here is going to run very, very cool, just because the GDDR5X really doesn't need that much power. And that 30 amp figure is actually like very much the top end of what GDDR5X could pull. So yeah, this VRM is plenty overkill for what it's trying to do here. So with that all covered, that pretty much sums up all of the VRMs. The memory VRM is not the strongest one I've seen on a 1080 Ti. Some of the other cards have stronger memory VRMs. However, it is certainly not underpowered. It's perfectly capable of powering the GDDR5X. It would be perfectly capable of taking a significant overvolt if you were inclined to mod your cards to do that. The Vcore VRM, again, it's the same, right around the same current handling capability and efficiency as the Founders Edition, but due to the layout, this one will run cooler. So generally, you should be able to push more current through the Vcore VRM on this card than on like a Founders Edition, because the Founders Edition will run its VRM hotter just because of how it's laid out and how it's cooled. The 1080 Ti's won't really even approach that 400 amp figure under, like, first of all, you're going to hit the power limit before you get anywhere near that. But more importantly, if you disable your power limit, which I will show you how to do very soon, well, mostly disable it, you would still not be able to hit that 400 amp figure because the card just does not need that much power. Even on liquid nitrogen or dry ice cooling or any kind of extreme cooling, you really don't need such a ridiculous amount of current. So mostly this really nice VRM we have here is a nice boost to efficiency and doesn't really do much for, like, it's not like the VRM was going to be limiting you for overclocking, but then again, so would none of the other cards. Now then, about disabling the power limit. If you want to disable the power limit on this card, you would want to short out this shunt, that shunt, and this shunt. So how this mod works is basically these are very, very low resistance resistors. If current goes through them, there is a very small amount of voltage drop across them, and that is then measured by a chip on the card, which is located right here. That measures that, and based on how much voltage drop there is across the shunt, the card can calculate how much power is going into it. Now, if you want to mod the power limit, you can either, try do it the proper way and get like a custom BIOS. Well, you would need, like, the proper way would be to get a BIOS with a higher power limit. Unfortunately, those don't exist and aren't going to exist anytime soon due to the restrictions NVIDIA puts on BIOS making. So your next best option is to just mess with the circuits that actually measure input current, like the amount of power the card is drawing. So for that, to do that, you would basically locate these three resistors. This one is for the PCIe slot, so if you don't want to put extra load on your PCIe slot for whatever reason, I've never actually seen a PCIe slot burn up yet, but if you don't want to risk, overdrawing your PCIe slot or overdrawing your motherboard's 24-pin, that's usually the bigger concern there, just ignore this one and only short out the two for the 8 pins. And to short them out, you have the option of either soldering another shunt of the same value on top of them, or using a liquid metal thermal paste, a very small amount of it. Don't put too much. If you put too much, then you'll run into an issue, but you can use a very small amount of liquid metal thermal paste to basically short the shunt from like this end to this end. You just cover it up like that, and you want a thin layer, because if you put too much, then the power reading will go too low, and the NVIDIA drivers will pick up that there's something wrong with the power reading, and they'll get your card stuck in safety mode. In which case you'll have to go and take like a isopropanol or acetone or some other alcohol and remove all the liquid metal thermal paste you just put on the shunt. Which you can also do if for whatever reason the card dies, like if you want to take the mod off again, you can just wipe it off with some kind of alcohol. Yeah, that's how you can mod the power limit, and you just do that on all the shunts you want to change the readings on, which I would recommend only doing the 2 8 pins, but if you really want more power, you can also do this one down here. So that's it for this PCB breakdown. MSI's done a, it's not the most powerful 1080 Ti PCB I've seen. It's not worse than the Founders Edition. It's certainly not going to limit you when overclocking in any way, shape, or form. It should run cooler than a Founders Edition card for sure, so this should at least have an extended lifespan, even if it doesn't really do anything for your overclocking capabilities. So with that all said and done, thank you for watching. Like, share, subscribe. Do consider donating to the Gamers Nexus Patreon to support what we do here. If you would like, the full performance review of this card, as well as thermal review of this card, will be coming up very soon, in a day or two, I've been told. And if you would like to see more content, like more PCB breakdowns like this, except done in a less professional manner, you could head over to my channel, which is actually Hardcore Overclocking, where I basically do overclocking stuff and lots of PCB breakdowns. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.